King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard, book review. So just a little bit of background if you're not familiar with this book. I suspect most people are. It's a classic, but some people may not be. So I'll give some brief background. This is a classic Victorian era British Empire adventure story. It was published in 1885. The author H. Rider Haggard was inspired after reading Treasure Island. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson had come out only a couple years beforehand. H. Rider Haggard had read Treasure Island, been enraptured by it, and thought, I want to write an adventure story that's every bit as good as Treasure Island. In fact, I think the rumor was he was trying to write something that was, he was trying to one-up it, write something that was even better than Treasure Island. It's been turned into any number of films. I think the most famous one, or the most classic one, was a film that came out in 1950. There was also a film that came out in 1985, which was In My Youth. I didn't actually see that film. To this day, I still haven't seen it, but I remember somewhat of the buzz around it. I remember King Solomon's Mines being, a word in the pop culture that you would hear. Also this book was the beginning of the Allan Quatermain series. Allan Quatermain is the protagonist in this book, but he would later go on to, there be a whole series spun out about his other adventures. And then Allan Quatermain, of course, pops up in a lot of these composite fiction things like, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. If anyone remembers that movie, Sean Connery was playing Allan Quatermain from this book. So that's the background. It's a book written for 12-year-old boys, essentially, is a target market, or at least that was the target market back in 1885. The prose is a little bit antiquated now. It's still readable, but it's a little bit of that stiff Victorian era prose. But I was attracted to reading it because at the time I was in the middle of writing my thesis in grad school and I was just depressed and I wanted some light escapist reading. And I stumbled across this in the library and I thought, perfect, a jungle adventure story, and it's a classic. So I can, check another one of those classics off my list. I had gotten the impression prior to reading this book, I think just from the movies, which again I haven't seen, but I'd seen the previews for them, I'd seen images from the movies, that this was going to be a jungle adventure story. That seems to be how it's always marketed in the movies. So, men hacking their way through thick jungle foliage, battling tigers and crocodiles and piranhas in the river and all the stuff that you usually see in a Tarzan movie or in a jungle movie. Little did I know that there is very little jungle in this movie. It's more of an African savanna story. So they are out in the wilderness, but they're crossing the African plains. There's a little bit of elephant hunting, but then most of the journey takes place in the African desert. And then it's not a jungle story at all. It's a desert story. It's a crossing the desert story. So what happens in a desert story? They talk about how they're really hot and they want water. And then it goes on for a few more pages and they still want water. And it's complaining about not having water, etc. I personally find desert stories to be a bit boring. They tend to be kind of one note. Oh, it's really hot and we want water. I was quite disappointed, to be honest, when I found out that this was not a jungle adventure story. But then they do get across the desert and they find a hidden kingdom, which is hidden away in the mountains. And then it becomes discovering a hidden kingdom story and restoring the rightful king to the throne story. Now, at the time I first read this, I thought this was kind of a genre story. But according to Wikipedia, which I looked up just right before doing this video, this is the book that started it all. Wikipedia said this was the book that started the whole genre of the Lost Kingdom or the Lost World stories. So, yeah, I guess it gets points for that. I hate to say it, though. I found the story pretty underwhelming. And I found the prose a bit underwhelming. And I found myself wondering if maybe in 1885, the standards were just a bit lower. I mean, I don't know. I know it's a classic book, and you hate to say this about a classic. But, I mean, you go into the bookstore nowadays, and you go to like the fantasy adventure section, and there's just tons of books, and it just goes on forever, because we're living in an era where it's very cheap to print all this stuff, and there's a huge market for it. I wonder if in 1885 there wasn't quite as much selection, and therefore the standards were lower. Or, I don't know, I mean, let me know in the comments if I'm completely wrong about this, because I legitimately don't know. I'm not an expert. Maybe they had a similar publishing industry back then as they do now. But, yeah, you do definitely get the sense that if this had come out by today's standards, if this had come out nowadays, it couldn't have gotten a publisher. It just doesn't seem that well written by today's standards, was my take. That's not to say it's completely worthless. There is a bit of wonder that comes through when the characters are descending from the mountains into this completely new land. And there are a couple of big epic battle scenes which are very well described and show a lot of imagination and how they're described and brought onto the page. I was just never able to get past the rather bare bones writing style and the skimpy plot. Now, admittedly, part of the problem is I'm not 12 years old anymore. And the target audience for this book is young boys. Again, it's the same target audience as the Treasure Island book. So, you know, I don't know. Maybe if I read this when I was younger, I would have enjoyed it more. Moving on to the politics of this book, or the political correctness aspect of it, or lack thereof. The publisher's introduction to my copy warns that H. Rider Haggard, the author, presents a rather patronizing view of native black Africans. And patronizing is about the right word for it. It's not a negative view necessarily. The black natives are presented as having their own code of honor, and there are a lot of elements of the noble savage stereotype in their portrayal. But they are often presented as childlike in comparison with the white protagonists. The black natives are easily impressed, easily persuaded, and never quite on the same intellectual level. They are capable of the greatest cruelties as well as the greatest bravery, depending on who gets them excited. And there are several little polemics against interracial romance in this book, and boy, have those not aged well at all. But it is a major theme in this book. It comes up several times. At one point, one of the native girls, when kind of trying to explain why she can't fall in love with the white man, muses, "Can the sun mate with the darkness, or the white with the black?" And later on, the main character and narrator repeats that to himself later in the book, like, "Ah, yeah, that was so true when she said that." As if that was some sort of ultimate truism instead of like a really bad analogy. I mean, I hate to get too much into it because I know I'm preaching to the converted, but what a really bad analogy that is. Can the sun mate with darkness or the white with the black? No, so white and black people can't mate. But I mean, if that's your logic, why stop there? I mean, why not say, well, a person with blonde hair could never fall in love with a person with brown hair? Because can the sun mate with darkness, or the white with the black? You could divide people up by hair color just as logically. I know. We're all in the 21st century here, so I'm preaching to the choir. I'll let it go. The interesting thing about this book, or about this author, author H. Rider Haggard actually did spend a number of years living in Africa. He was British, but lived in Africa for a number of years. So he wasn't simply just writing this back in the library in London. This is a contrast to Edgar Rice Burroughs, who did the Tarzan series. Edgar Rice Burroughs famously, or infamously, never went to Africa. So when he's writing all about Tarzan in Africa, it's all just completely out of his imagination. H. Rider Haggard spent a lot of time in Africa, so his portrayal maybe is worth something. I don't know, I've never been to Africa. It is a pity, though, that that experience did not cause him to have a more enlightened view of the African natives, and yet that's often the way it works, isn't it? I mean, we like to think that proximity would bring about enlightened attitudes, but, I mean, it didn't in the American South during slavery, right? Even though the whites were working right next to the blacks on the slavery plantations, that didn't change attitudes. I don't know. It's a funny thing, racism, isn't it? I'll leave it there. In closing, I know I've said a number of negative things about this book, but I didn't hate it completely. And if I really would have hated it, I never would have finished it. The books I hate, I don't finish, generally. It's a very short book, only 214 pages. It reads fairly quickly. For all its faults, the pace is pretty quick, so it's not like you get bored with it, or you don't have to have any slogs for long, boring descriptions. And I was therefore able to sit down and read it for long periods of time and finish it off within a few days. So it's not perfect, but it's a classic. It's a quick little fun read. On balance, I'd recommend it just because, it's a classic. And who doesn't like checking another classic off of their list? But yeah, it does have some issues.